Between 1956 and 1980, one simple innovation eliminated 60,000 American dockworker jobs, while saving the global economy an estimated $500 billion annually in shipping costs. The math is absolutely brutal. Containerization reduced cargo loading costs by 97%, from $5.86 per ton down to just 16 cents per ton, but it destroyed entire working-class communities across America's port cities in the process. Before I tell you exactly how 5 crane operators working 12 hours replaced 100 longshoremen, laboring for 4 full days straight, let me show you something that will permanently change how you see every single product in your home. That coffee mug imported from Vietnam, that laptop assembled in Taiwan, those running shoes manufactured in Indonesia, that cheap furniture from China, literally every single one of these items arrived on a container ship. That container ship represents the single technological innovation that fundamentally reshaped global economics, while simultaneously obliterating one of America's most powerful and well-paid blue-collar professions. Here's what most people completely miss about containerization and why this story matters so much today. This wasn't just an efficiency upgrade or some gradual technological improvement that happened over decades. This was economic warfare, disguised as industrial progress. And the dock workers who stood on America's piers in 1956, watching Malcolm McLean's first container ship get loaded, understood it immediately. They knew that the moment that SS Ideal X left Newark Harbor carrying 58 metal containers, their profession had entered an irreversible death spiral. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to 1955, the final year before containers changed everything about global trade. America's major ports employed approximately 75,000 longshoremen, earning between $25 and $35 per hour in current equivalent dollars. When you factor in the mandatory overtime that was standard in the industry, and the excellent union-negotiated benefits packages, this translates to roughly $200,000 to $250,000 annually in today's purchasing power. These weren't minimum wage positions. These weren't entry-level jobs. These were genuine middle-class careers that built entire neighborhoods and sustained working-class families for generations. The work itself was brutal, dangerous, and physically demanding in ways that modern Americans struggle to comprehend. Loading a single cargo ship in 1955 required approximately 100 workers laboring continuously for 4 to 5 full days in rotating 8-hour shifts. Every single crate measuring 6 feet by 4 feet, every wooden barrel containing chemicals or foodstuffs, every cardboard box of manufactured goods had to be moved entirely by hand from the dock into the ship's cargo hold. Workers used hand trucks for smaller items, rope slings and winches for heavier cargo, and their own backs and physical strength for everything else. They loaded literally thousands of individual items into cargo spaces that had been designed decades earlier, specifically for this exact type of manual handling. The physical danger was genuine and constant. Longshoremen suffered injury rates approximately 5 times higher than average manufacturing workers. Cargo could shift unexpectedly, crushing workers. Rope slings could snap, sending heavy loads falling, and workers could fall into cargo holds. The constant physical strain led to chronic back injuries, hernias, and disabilities that ended careers prematurely. Deaths on the docks were not uncommon, with approximately 200 longshoremen killed annually in work-related accidents during the 1950s across American ports. The skilled nature of the work often gets overlooked in modern discussions. Experienced longshoremen needed to understand cargo weight distribution to prevent ships from becoming unstable and potentially capsizing. They needed to know which types of cargo could be stacked together safely and which needed separation. They understood how different materials responded to ocean conditions during transport. This wasn't mindless manual labor, it was skilled craft work that took years to master fully, and that knowledge had genuine economic value. The International Longshoremen's Association controlled these East and Gulf Coast ports with absolutely iron-fisted union power. They had genuinely good reasons to protect their turf aggressively. These jobs represented some of the few blue-collar positions in America, where workers without college degrees could earn middle-class incomes and provide their families with genuine economic security. The ILA negotiated strict work rules, manning requirements, and guaranteed minimum crew sizes that protected employment even during slow periods. These rules specified exactly how many workers had to be assigned to each task, creating inefficiencies that employers resented but accepted as the price of labor peace. The union's power stemmed from its ability to completely shut down ports through coordinated strikes. A unified work stoppage at major East Coast ports could paralyze American trade within days. That leverage allowed the ILA to extract favorable contracts and resist management attempts to increase productivity, but that same leverage would prove useless against technological change that eliminated the need for workers entirely. On the West Coast, the International Longshoremen's and Warehouse Union held similar power over Pacific ports, running from San Diego all the way to Seattle. The LW had emerged from the brutal 1934 West Coast waterfront strike that resulted in 2 workers killed and dozens injured. But that strike ultimately secured union recognition and substantially improved working conditions. By the 1950s, these unions represented over 100,000 dock workers nationwide at peak employment periods. Then, in 1955, Malcolm McLean showed up with an idea that would eventually destroy their entire world. McLean wasn't some ivory tower engineer or corporate executive. He was a trucker from North Carolina who got frustrated watching his drivers wait hours and sometimes entire days at ports to unload cargo. What if, McLean wondered, instead of unloading every single item from the truck, you just loaded the entire truck trailer onto the ship? Cut out all that manual handling, all that sorting, all those workers, all that wasted time. The concept seemed almost stupidly simple in retrospect, but it was genuinely revolutionary. Every previous attempt at unitized cargo, pallets, platforms, special containers, had failed because there was no standardization. McLean's insight was that you needed a universal standard container that could move seamlessly from truck to ship to train, without ever being opened. On April 26, 1956, the SS Ideal X departed from Port Newark, New Jersey, bound for Houston, Texas. It carried 58 aluminum truck bodies stacked on its deck like giant Lego blocks. That single voyage represented the first commercial container ship movement in history. The cost analysis from that trip would do the entire longshoreman profession. Traditional break bulk shipping cost $5.86 per ton to load. The Ideal X's containers cost 16 cents per ton. That's a 97% cost reduction that would eventually reshape literally every aspect of global trade. But here's the number that matters most to this story, the number that explains everything. That same ship that previously required 100 workers, laboring for 4 full days now, required just 12 crew members and 5 longshoremen working 12 hours to load completely. The productivity improvement wasn't 10% or 20% or even 50%. Container shipping eliminated 95% of manual dock labor almost overnight. The economics were undeniable, overwhelming, and absolutely devastating for anyone who made their living loading ships by hand. The longshoremen watched Malcolm McLean's early container experiments, with growing alarm that quickly turned into existential terror. Union leaders understood immediately and exactly what containerization meant: permanent job elimination on a scale their organizations had never faced. This wasn't about productivity improvements or wage negotiations or better working conditions. This was about whether their profession would continue to exist at all in any meaningful form. Every single container that got loaded represented 5 or 10 or 20 dock workers who would never work again. Within just 5 years, McLean's company Sealand Service had proved the container concept worked at commercial scale. The momentum became impossible to stop. By 1961, Sealand was running regular container service between Newark and Houston, then expanded to Puerto Rico. Eventually, they secured a contract to ship military supplies to Vietnam during the war. The U.S. military saw the strategic advantage immediately. Containers could move supplies faster, more securely, and far more efficiently than any previous method. In 1956, American ports handled approximately 60 million tons of general cargo annually. Ships sat in port for an average of 3 weeks while being manually loaded and unloaded. By 1970, containerization had reduced average port turnaround time to 24 hours while handling double the cargo volume. By 1980, major container ports were processing ships in under 12 hours while moving 3 times the cargo. The efficiency gains were absolutely staggering, and the human cost was mounting rapidly and visibly. Port of New York employment numbers tell this story in stark, brutal detail. In 1950, the port complex employed 35,000 longshoremen during peak shipping season. Another 10,000 warehouse workers, freight handlers, and support staff directly depended on cargo handling operations. By 1970, that number had dropped to just 12,000 longshoremen. By 1980, only 8,000 remained. By 2000, fewer than 4,000 dock workers were employed across the entire New York-New Jersey port complex, despite handling 5 times more cargo than in 1950. These weren't jobs that moved to other cities or transitioned to different industries. They simply vanished. And here's what every economic analysis conveniently ignores. These were geographically concentrated jobs. You couldn't be a longshoreman in Kansas or Arizona or anywhere more than commuting distance from a major port. You worked in New York, New Jersey, Boston, Baltimore, New Orleans, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, or maybe a handful of other coastal cities. When those jobs disappeared from those specific locations, entire neighborhoods collapsed economically. The wages tell an important part of this story that often gets overlooked. In 1956, experienced longshoremen earned approximately $4.50 per hour. That seems modest until you properly account for the mandatory overtime and guaranteed daily minimum wages. Most dock workers cleared between $12,000 and $15,000 annually, equivalent to $125,000 to $160,000 in today's purchasing power. These were genuinely middle-class incomes that supported homeownership, college education for children, and economic security. But containerization didn't just reduce headcount brutally, it fundamentally changed the entire skill set required. Traditional longshoremen needed exceptional physical strength, careful coordination, and deep knowledge of cargo handling techniques. Container crane operators needed technical training and could be replaced relatively easily. The profession lost its craft status almost overnight. The accumulated knowledge of generations of dock workers became essentially worthless in the container era. The union fought back with literally everything they had. The International Longshoremen's Association negotiated guaranteed annual income agreements in the early 1960s. These contracts essentially paid workers not to work as automation progressively took their jobs. They cost shipping companies and port authorities millions of dollars annually, but even shipping executives agreed to pay because the cost savings from containerization were so enormous. Companies could afford to pay off displaced workers and still profit massively from the transition. In 1963, the ILA negotiated what was considered a groundbreaking labor agreement. They secured $29 million paid out annually over 5 years for job security provisions. This affected approximately 50,000 workers across all East Coast and Gulf Coast ports. The agreement guaranteed companies and terminal operators agreed to these expensive terms because containerization still delivered massive savings. That agreement tells you absolutely everything you need to know about containerization economics. Companies and terminal operators agreed to these expensive terms because containerization still delivered massive savings. That agreement tells you absolutely everything you need to know about containerization economics. If companies could pay $29 million annually to buy out workers and still save money by automating, the productivity gains had to be extraordinary. And they were a single modern container port could process more cargo in 1 day than an equivalent pre-container facility could handle in a month. With 90% fewer workers, The port operators ran detailed cost-benefit analyses that made the economic case undeniable. Loading a 10,000-ton cargo ship manually required roughly 400 worker hours at $15 per hour, including benefits, totaling $6,000 in labor costs. Container loading required just 40 worker hours at the same rate, totaling $600 in labor costs. That's a $5,400 saving per ship, and major ports were handling hundreds of ships monthly. Multiply those savings across thousands of ships annually at dozens of ports worldwide, and you get the $500 billion annual global savings figure. The shipping industry experienced a golden age of profitability in the 1970s and 80s as containerization rolled out globally. Companies that invested early in container technology captured enormous competitive advantages over slower-moving rivals. Sealand service grew from a regional operator to a global powerhouse worth hundreds of millions. McLean's competitors who resisted containerization or adopted it too slowly either adapted quickly or went bankrupt. United States Lines, once one of America's largest shipping companies, delayed container adoption and filed for bankruptcy in 1986. Dozens of smaller regional carriers simply disappeared, as containerization required massive capital investments in ships and port infrastructure. The industry consolidated dramatically, with global giants absorbing struggling regional players. Today's container shipping industry bears almost no resemblance to the fragmented competitive market of the 1950s. In 1966, just 10 years after the SS Idealex's maiden voyage, global container port traffic reached approximately 1 million TEUs. TEUs, 20-foot equivalent units, are the standard measurement for container capacity. By 1970, that number hit 10 million TEUs. By 1980, global ports were handling 40 million TEUs annually. By 2000, the figure reached 236 million TEUs. Today, global ports process over 800 million TEUs every single year. Every single one of those containers represents cargo that would have employed multiple longshoremen in the pre-container era. Let me give you the math that shows exactly how devastating this was. If one container requires 95% less labor than equivalent breakbulk cargo and global trade volume has increased 20-fold, the job displacement compounds exponentially. 20 times more cargo with 95% less labor per unit equals the near-total elimination of traditional dock worker jobs. Let me give you the financial perspective that shipping companies saw. In 1955, cargo handling labor costs represented approximately 35 to 50% of total shipping expenses. By 1975, containerization had reduced cargo handling costs to just 10% to 15% of total shipping expenses. For a shipping company moving $100 million in goods annually, that translated to approximately $25 million in direct savings every single year. Those savings didn't just disappear into corporate coffers. The savings flowed throughout the entire supply chain. They went to consumers through dramatically lower prices on imported goods, to retailers through better profit margins, to manufacturers who could locate production anywhere in the world, and to shipping companies themselves through substantially increased profitability. Consider this striking comparison that shows how revolutionary containerization was. In 1956, shipping goods from New York to Europe cost approximately $420 per ton for general breakbulk cargo. That's equivalent to roughly $4,400 per ton in today's dollars. By 1976, containerized shipping had reduced that cost to approximately $50 per ton in nominal dollars. And this happened during a period when inflation was running over 6% annually. Adjusted for inflation, the real cost reduction exceeded 90% in just 20 years. This price collapse directly triggered the massive globalization wave we're still experiencing today. Suddenly, manufacturing products in Asia and shipping them to America costs substantially less than manufacturing domestically. The container ship made global supply chains economically rational for the first time in human history. Those enormous savings enabled globalization on a scale coordinated through a global supply chain that moves parts in containers. The logistics costs for a $1,000 iPhone are approximately $10 total. Before containerization, shipping costs were so high that only high-value goods could be profitably traded internationally. Luxury items, specialized machinery, strategic resources, these were the primary products that moved across oceans. Containerization reduced shipping costs so dramatically that suddenly even low-value goods could be manufactured on one continent and profitably sold on another. The numbers illustrate this transformation with crystal clarity. In 1960, international trade represented approximately 25% of global GDP. By 1980, that figure had risen to 35%. By 2000, it reached 50%. Today, international trade exceeds 60% of global GDP. Economists directly attribute roughly 40% of that growth to reduced transportation costs from containerization. The World Bank calculated that containerization's impact on global trade costs was equivalent to a 45 percentage point reduction in tariffs. To put that in perspective, eliminating every tariff on Earth would have less impact on trade than the container had. Companies could suddenly manufacture products in China where labor costs were 90% lower. They could ship them halfway around the world to America for less than $1 per unit, and still dramatically undercut domestic production costs that included American wages. The iPhone in your pocket exists in its current form because containers made this exact business model economically viable. A modern iPhone contains components from over 200 suppliers across 30 countries. They are coordinated through a global supply chain that moves parts in containers. The logistics costs for a $1,000 iPhone are approximately $10 total. Without containerization, those logistics costs might be $200 or more, making the entire business model economically impossible. But the 60,000 American longshoremen who lost their jobs between 1956 and 1980 didn't get to share in those aggregate economic gains. They got early retirement packages that didn't come close to replacing their lost lifetime earnings. They got retraining programs that rarely led to comparable employment. They watched the slow dissolution of the working-class communities that had been built around port economies over generations. The downstream economic impact extended far beyond the docks themselves. Warehouses near ports employed thousands of additional workers handling breakbulk cargo. Containers eliminated the vast majority of that work. Goods stayed in sealed containers from origin until final destination, often hundreds of miles inland. One modern distribution center receiving containers can do the work that dozens of traditional port-adjacent warehouses did. Port-adjacent manufacturing also collapsed as a viable economic model. Before containerization, it made tremendous economic sense to locate factories near major ports. Breakbulk shipping was so expensive that companies located production facilities as close to ports as possible. Containerization made transportation so cheap that manufacturers could locate literally anywhere with good rail or highway access. This killed another entire layer of port city employment that had existed for generations. Insurance companies, freight forwarders, customs brokers, and shipping agents all employed far fewer people. Containerization simplified and standardized shipping processes across the board. The ripple effects of those lost dock worker jobs destroyed the entire economic ecosystem that had sustained port cities for centuries. Now here's a number that captures the brutal efficiency with devastating clarity. In 1956, American ports employed approximately 1.25 workers per 1,000 tons of cargo handled annually. By 1990, that ratio had plummeted to just 0.15 workers per 1,000 tons. This happened even as total cargo volume increased from approximately 60 million tons to over 400 million tons annually. That's a 90% productivity increase that translated directly into 90% fewer jobs per unit of cargo handled. The racial dimension of this story matters deeply, but often gets completely overlooked. Longshoremen jobs were among the very few blue-collar positions that paid genuine middle-class wages to black workers and other minorities. This was particularly true in major cities like New York, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New Orleans, and Mobile. These ports had substantial percentages of black dock workers who earned incomes that supported homeownership and sent children to college. In New York specifically, approximately 40% of longshoremen in the 1950s were black or Puerto Rican workers. These jobs provided critical pathways to economic opportunity and middle-class stability. When containerization eliminated those jobs, it disproportionately destroyed economic mobility in minority communities. The union contracts that paid displaced workers not to work became infamous examples of featherbedding. Conservative political rhetoric attacked them as paying people to do nothing. But these agreements represented desperate attempts to preserve livelihoods in the face of overwhelming technological change. When you're watching your entire profession being automated out of existence, guaranteed income sounds like survival, not special treatment. By 1980, the fundamental transformation was essentially complete across American ports. Containerization had become the dominant form of ocean shipping. Traditional breakbulk cargo operations had largely disappeared from major ports. Dock employment had fallen from its 1955 peak of 75,000 workers to approximately 15,000. The shipping industry had completely restructured around this revolutionary but economically brutal technology. Malcolm McLean, the man who started this revolution, sold his sea-land service to R.J. Reynolds for $530 million in 1969. That's equivalent to approximately $3.8 billion in today's dollars. He personally made an enormous fortune revolutionizing global logistics. Meanwhile, the dock workers whose careers his innovation destroyed struggled desperately to find comparable employment. The International Longshoremen's Association had been one of America's most powerful unions. At peak, they had over 100,000 members during the 1950s. Membership declined to approximately 65,000 by 1980. The union continues gradually shrinking as automation advances. The organization that could once paralyze international trade now represents a fraction of its former power. Container shipping companies consolidated dramatically into massive global operators. Only companies with extensive international networks could capture containerization's full economic benefits. The industry that employed hundreds of small regional companies in the 1950s now concentrates in the hands of global giants. Denmark's Maersk, Switzerland's MSC, France's CMA-CGM handle the vast majority of global container traffic. Today's largest container ships carry over 24,000 TEUs in standardized containers. They require crews of just 20 to 25 people, including officers. They can be completely loaded or unloaded at major ports in under 24 hours. A single voyage on one of these massive vessels moves more cargo than dozens of traditional vessels. With literally thousands fewer workers involved at every stage, Brooklyn's Red Hook neighborhood tells this story with devastating clarity. It serves as the quintessential example of containerization's community impact. In 1950, the Red Hook waterfront area bustled with approximately 20,000 dock workers during peak shipping season. The neighborhood was supported by literally hundreds of small businesses providing essential services. There were over 50 bars and restaurants serving dock workers. Dozens of maritime supply companies, multiple trucking companies, freight forwarding businesses, marine insurance agents, ship chandlers, and a complete economic ecosystem built around cargo handling. The average household income in Red Hook in 1950 exceeded the New York City median by approximately 15%. This reflected the relatively high wages that dock work provided. By 1980, after container operations moved across the harbor to Port Newark, Elizabeth, Red Hook had become an economic disaster zone. Household incomes fell to 40% below the city median. Unemployment rates in the neighborhood exceeded 25% during the early 1980s. Home ownership rates dropped from over 60% to under 30%. The small businesses that had served the dock economy closed by the dozens. Boarded-up storefronts appeared throughout the neighborhood. Crime rates spiked as economic opportunities vanished. Property values collapsed. Community institutions closed. And economic prospects evaporated completely. The transition wasn't gradual or managed. It was sudden and catastrophic. Port Newark opened its first container terminal in 1962. By 1965, the majority of cargo had shifted away from Brooklyn. By 1970, Red Hook's piers were largely abandoned, and the neighborhood was in free fall. Within just 15 years, a thriving working-class community had been economically destroyed. San Francisco's waterfront experienced devastation that was equally comprehensive. The city's famous Embarcadero was lined with working piers employing thousands. The ferry building sat at the center of a bustling working waterfront that generated middle-class incomes. Containerization shifted virtually all cargo operations to Oakland across the bay. Oakland had available land for the massive container stacking yards that modern operations require. San Francisco's dock employment dropped from approximately 11,000 workers in 1960 to under 2,000 by 1980. Most of those remaining jobs were administrative rather than cargo handling positions. The waterfront properties that once housed cargo operations became prime real estate for development. The Embarcadero transformation from working port to tourist destination began in the 1980s and accelerated in the 1990s. What was once America's busiest West Coast port became restaurants, shopping centers, and corporate office space. Property values skyrocketed, pricing out the working-class families whose incomes had depended on port operations. Baltimore experienced a similar transformation but tried a different approach to economic redevelopment. The inner harbor, once lined with cargo piers employing thousands, was deliberately converted into a mixed-use development in the 1970s. The city invested heavily in museums, tourist attractions, and commercial development to replace lost port employment. The National Aquarium, Harbor Place Shopping Center, and convention facilities created new jobs in hospitality and retail. But these service industry positions paid substantially less than the union dockworker jobs they replaced. Average wages in Baltimore's inner harbor tourism industry ran $30,000 to $40,000 annually, compared to the $125,000 that experienced longshoremen had earned. The jobs replacement worked numerically. Thousands of new positions were created. But the economic replacement failed. Working-class families couldn't maintain middle-class stability on tourism wages. New Orleans faced perhaps the most devastating port employment collapse of any major American city. The port had employed over 12,000 longshoremen in 1960, with another 8,000 workers in related maritime industries. Container operations shifted to specialized terminals outside the traditional port areas. By 1985, fewer than 3,000 dock workers remained employed. The neighborhoods that had depended on port employment, particularly working-class black communities in the lower Ninth Ward and nearby areas, saw unemployment rates exceed 30%. Poverty rates doubled in less than a decade. Property values collapsed as families lost income, and young people moved elsewhere seeking opportunity. The economic devastation contributed to urban decay that plagued New Orleans for decades. Even the 2005 Hurricane Katrina disaster can be partially traced back to containerization's economic impacts. The neighborhoods that flooded most catastrophically were those where port employment had collapsed 30 years earlier. Lack of economic investment, deferred infrastructure maintenance, and concentrated poverty all made these areas more vulnerable. When the levees failed, the communities that suffered most were those that had never recovered from losing their port economy. The International Longshoremen's and Warehouse Union on the West Coast took a pragmatic approach. In 1960, the ILW negotiated the Mechanization and Modernization Agreement. They formally accepted automation in exchange for generous early retirement packages and guaranteed wages. Union leadership calculated that fighting automation was ultimately futile. Protecting the workers who remained was more important than attempting to preserve every job. That agreement cost shipping companies and terminal operators approximately $29 million over 5 years. It paid off roughly 15,000 workers who would be displaced by containerization. The agreement provided $7,920 to workers who left with 25 years of service. That's roughly equivalent to $75,000 in today's dollars. For workers with their entire adult lives invested in their profession, this was a few years' salary in exchange for permanent career termination. Both East and West Coast unions saw brutal, lengthy strikes throughout the 1960s and 70s. In 1968, a devastating 57-day strike paralyzed all major East Coast ports. The ILA fought for guarantees that containers wouldn't eliminate jobs faster than workers could retire naturally. The strike cost the American economy an estimated $1 billion in delayed shipments. But it only temporarily delayed the inevitable technological transformation. In 1971, a 134-day West Coast dock strike became the longest maritime labor dispute in United States history. It centered almost entirely on automation, containerization, and manning requirements. The ILW demanded that employers guarantee minimum crew sizes for container operations. The employers refused, knowing that accepting those terms would negate containerization's cost savings. The strike eventually ended with a compromise that satisfied nobody. These weren't symbolic protests or performative labor actions. These were genuinely existential battles for economic survival. Dock workers understood that once containerization fully took hold, their leverage would vanish entirely. A small number of crane operators could move vastly more cargo than hundreds of traditional longshoremen. Workers were absolutely right to fear that future. The strikes cost billions in delayed shipments and disrupted supply chains. But they only managed to delay the inevitable by a few years at most. By 1980, containerization had become the absolute global standard for ocean shipping. Ports that resisted the technology found themselves economically obsolete. Ships simply diverted to ports that offered faster, cheaper container handling. Holdout ports lost business until they either adopted containers or closed permanently. Let me show you the extraordinary scale of what was built to replace traditional dock workers. A modern post-Panamax container crane stands approximately 350 feet tall. It weighs roughly 2,000 tons and costs about $15 million to purchase and install. It can move 40 to 50 containers per hour when operated efficiently. One single crane operated by one single worker does the work that an entire shift of manual longshoremen did. Modern container terminals don't have just one crane, they have dozens. The Port of Los Angeles has over 90 container cranes. The Port of Long Beach has over 70. These machines completely replaced human labor for the core function of loading and unloading ships. The Port of Los Angeles Long Beach Complex is America's largest container port. It handles approximately 40% of all containerized imports entering the United States. It now processes over 17 million TEUs annually, with approximately 15,000 direct employees. In the break bulk era, moving equivalent cargo would have required over 100,000 dock workers just for loading operations. That represents an 85% workforce reduction, even as cargo volume increased 20-fold. Here's the economic paradox that makes this entire story so complicated. Containerization saves consumers and businesses approximately $500 billion annually in shipping costs. The World Bank estimated that containerization reduced shipping costs by such an enormous magnitude. Its impact on global trade was equivalent to eliminating all tariffs and trade barriers worldwide. Think about that comparison for a moment. The container had a bigger impact on enabling global trade than removing every single government-imposed trade restriction on the planet. The cost savings compound even further with modern automation technology. The Port of Rotterdam opened Maasvlakte II in 2015, a fully automated container terminal. Unmanned robotic stacking cranes and autonomous vehicles move containers without any human intervention. The productivity gains make even 20th-century containerization look inefficient. American ports are following this automation trajectory, despite fierce union opposition. The Port of Los Angeles has gradually introduced automated stacking cranes and gate systems. The Port of Long Beach plans further automation to compete globally. This means even the remaining dock jobs face technological obsolescence. In 2023, the International Longshoremen's Association threatened strikes over automation issues, particularly the introduction of automated gates and remote-controlled cranes. The same battle that raged in the 1960s continues today. But unions now have far less leverage than they did 60 years ago. The economic argument for automation remains overwhelming. A fully automated terminal can operate 24/7 without fatigue or shift changes. It eliminates workplace injuries and processes containers 30% faster than manual operations. The Port of Los Angeles provides an extraordinarily clear window into the future. It handles approximately 9 million TEUs annually. That's roughly 25% of all containerized imports. Port authorities face an enormous pressure from shipping companies to match competitor efficiency levels. This creates a race toward automation that no individual port can realistically. Containerization represents perhaps the single most perfect textbook example in modern economic history. Enormous aggregate benefits distributed globally, devastating concentrated costs falling on specific workers. This includes expanded remote crane operation from centralized control rooms, autonomous vehicle systems throughout terminals to move containers without human drivers, artificial intelligence systems to optimize vessel loading sequences. These planned improvements will reduce total direct port employment by an estimated 30% over the next decade. That means eliminating approximately another 4,500 jobs. The technology being deployed is genuinely impressive from an engineering standpoint. Modern automated stacking cranes use GPS positioning accurate to within 1 centimeter. Optical sensors identify damaged containers automatically. Sophisticated software optimizes container stacking to minimize future moves. These systems can operate in conditions dangerous for human workers. Heavy rain, dense fog, extreme heat. Performance doesn't degrade. Productivity increases of 25% to 35% are typical when ports transition to automated operations. But each percentage point of productivity improvement translates directly into eliminated jobs. When a port can process 35% more containers with 30% fewer workers, the economics become compelling for terminal operators. Port authorities face enormous pressure from shipping companies to match competitor efficiency levels. This creates a race toward automation that no individual port can realistically. Containerization represents perhaps the single most perfect textbook example in modern economic history. Enormous aggregate benefits distributed globally, devastating concentrated costs falling on specific workers. Let me give you the current financial comparison. A traditional container terminal employing 500 workers might process 1 million TEUs annually. Total labor cost runs roughly $50 million, including wages, benefits, insurance, and overhead. An automated terminal processing the same volume requires approximately 150 workers. Labor costs drop to $15 million. That $35 million in annual savings justifies the enormous $500 million automation investment in roughly 15 years. Modern port terminals operate for 50 years or more, making the long-term economics absolutely compelling. Those enormous savings from automation manifest directly in lower shipping costs. This benefits literally everyone who purchases imported goods, which is essentially every single person in modern America. Your $800 iPhone would cost substantially more if containerization hadn't reduced shipping costs from potentially $100 per unit to under $10. Global trade as we know it depends completely on container shipping's extreme cost efficiency. The global container shipping industry now moves approximately $12 trillion worth of goods annually. It represents roughly 80% of global trade measured by cargo volume. It operates with approximately 200,000 seafarers on vessels worldwide. About 150,000 port workers handle all container operations globally. Compare those employment numbers to the millions who would be required using pre-container methods. You begin to understand the extraordinary scale of job elimination that containerization has produced. Comprehensive economic studies consistently show that containerization contributes between 1% and 2% to annual global GDP growth. It makes international trade vastly more efficient and economically viable. That contribution represents approximately $800 billion to $1.6 trillion in additional economic output every single year. Those benefits are distributed broadly across billions of consumers and millions of businesses. Academic studies that tracked displaced dock workers showed genuinely grim outcomes. A comprehensive 1982 Department of Labor analysis found that longshoremen who lost jobs in the 1970s took an average wage cut of 35%. Approximately 40% of displaced workers never found steady full-time work again. These weren't jobs you could easily replace with comparable careers. The skills were highly specialized. Work locations were geographically fixed. Middle-class wages were essentially unavailable in other blue-collar professions accessible to workers without college degrees. The younger workers who might have become longshoremen never got any chance. Port employment became a shrinking profession with virtually no new hiring. This completely cut off that traditional pathway to middle-class wages. The sons and daughters of dock workers had to pursue completely different careers. Economists have a term for this pattern: creative destruction. Innovation creates massive aggregate economic value while simultaneously destroying existing industries and jobs. Containerization represents perhaps the single most perfect textbook example in modern economic history. Enormous aggregate benefits distributed globally, devastating concentrated costs falling on specific workers, and absolutely no realistic way to stop the technological transformation once it started. The fundamental policy question that nobody answered satisfactorily: who should bear the economic costs of technological progress? Should 60,000 workers sacrifice their entire livelihoods so that hundreds of millions of consumers can purchase slightly cheaper imported goods? Should the $500 billion in annual savings be partially redirected to substantially compensate those who lost everything? The guaranteed annual income programs that unions negotiated were crude attempts at this redistribution. They forced companies to share a small portion of automation savings with displaced workers. But these programs were always explicitly temporary and politically unpopular. They ultimately couldn't match the massive scale of permanent job losses. Modern policy proposals for universal basic income or wage insurance stem partly from the containerization experience. If technology inevitably eliminates jobs while creating enormous aggregate benefits, prominent economists argue we need systematic mechanisms. The European model provides an instructive contrast. Denmark's flexicurity system combines relatively easy firing procedures with extremely generous unemployment benefits. It includes comprehensive retraining programs and active labor market policies. When Danish dock workers lost jobs to containerization, they received up to 90% of their previous salary for up to 4 years while retraining. They got subsidized education programs, career counseling, and job placement assistance. The outcomes were dramatically better than in America. Danish displaced dock workers saw wage declines averaging just 15% compared to 35% in the United States. Only 10% never found steady work again compared to 40% in America. The cost of these programs is substantial. Denmark spends approximately 2.5% of GDP on active labor market policies. The United States spends less than 0.1%. But Danish voters apparently consider this a worthwhile investment in social stability. American policy has historically taken the opposite approach. It provides minimal support and expects individuals to bear the full cost of economic transitions. Here's the uncomfortable reality that emerged from the containerization experience. American economic policy largely abandoned displaced dock workers to pure market forces. Some workers receive union-negotiated severance packages. Many received absolutely nothing. Port-dependent communities slowly collapsed or radically transformed. The economic pain was genuine and lasting for affected workers and communities, even as containerization simultaneously made imported goods cheaper for hundreds of millions of consumers. Every container ship you see passing by offshore represents an economic miracle. A modern, ultra-large container vessel can move 24,000 TEUs. It carries potentially up to 240 million pounds of cargo across oceans in just 2 weeks. With a crew of 25 people and a shipping cost of roughly $1 to $2 per ton. That extreme efficiency enables the entire structure of modern global commerce. But that same efficiency was purchased directly through permanent economic destruction. It destroyed America's traditional dock worker profession and the communities that depended on port employment. Today, container shipping remains an intensely competitive global industry. This drives companies relentlessly toward even greater automation and cost reduction. Ultra-large container vessels currently being built carry 24,000 TEUs or more. They require essentially the same 20-person crew as much smaller vessels. They further reduce per-unit shipping costs through pure economies of scale. Every marginal efficiency gain eliminates another small fraction of remaining port employment. Labor unions continue fighting automation plans aggressively. They argue that further mechanization threatens community stability and national security. Union leaders point out that automated systems can be hacked by hostile actors. They can fail catastrophically during emergencies. They eliminate the skilled workforce needed to manage complex operations during crises. The COVID pandemic proved some of these union concerns partially valid. During 2020 and 2021, global supply chains essentially seized up. It was human workers rapidly adapting, not automated systems, that kept cargo moving through bottlenecks. The Port of Long Beach's manual terminals actually adapted faster than automated facilities. But the fundamental long-term trajectory remains absolutely clear. Port automation will inexorably continue advancing. Dock worker employment will continue declining. The profession of longshoremen will increasingly resemble a historical curiosity. The underlying economics simply favor automation far too strongly. Malcolm McLean died in 2001 at age 87. He was widely celebrated as a transformative logistics innovator who revolutionized global trade. His invention of standardized containerization ranks alongside Henry Ford's assembly line and the Internet. The International Longshoremen's Association has never issued statements celebrating innovators whose inventions destroyed members' careers. The container itself is arguably the most economically important industrial design of the 20th century. It's deliberately boring, completely utilitarian, and responsible for reshaping the global economy more profoundly than virtually any single technology besides the microprocessor and Internet. Consider what that standardization fundamentally enables. A container loaded at a factory in Shenzhen can be trucked to the port. Mechanically loaded onto a ship, transported across the Pacific, unloaded and loaded onto a train, delivered to Chicago. Without the container's contents ever being touched by human hands after initial loading, every single transition happens purely mechanically, eliminating human labor at every stage of a 7,000-mile journey. That seamless movement makes modern global supply chains economically possible, but it simultaneously makes nearly every worker throughout the logistics chain increasingly replaceable. Longshoremen lost their jobs first because they were the most obvious target for automation. But warehouse workers, truck drivers, and eventually ship crews face identical technological pressure. Autonomous trucks are already being tested extensively for container transport. Fully automated warehouses operate with minimal human intervention. Remote-controlled and eventually autonomous cargo ships are under active development. The trajectory that began with containerization, it cost an estimated $60 billion in delayed shipments. One ship, 6 days. What makes the longshoremen's story particularly poignant is that their defeat was genuinely inevitable. Once the container technology proved economically viable, no force could stop it. No amount of union power, political intervention, or public sympathy could override the economic logic. 97% cost reduction and 90% productivity improvement were simply overwhelming. When one crane operator can perform the work of 20 longshoremen, when port turnaround drops from 3 weeks to 1 day, the economic pressure becomes unstoppable. The only meaningful question was how quickly the transition would happen, and whether displaced workers would receive any meaningful support. The answer? The transition happened as quickly as container infrastructure could be built. Displaced workers received minimal support beyond what unions could extract through strikes. American economic policy offered virtually no systematic governmental response. Compare this to Germany's social market economy model. Comprehensive government programs provided extensive retraining, relocation assistance, and generous income support. German dock workers faced identical job losses from the same technology, but they received far more comprehensive support for transitioning to new careers. The American free market approach relied on temporary union payments and expected workers to independently find new employment in markets with no demand for their skills. The results speak for themselves through decades of data. Working-class communities around American ports suffered economic decline that persists today. Brooklyn's Red Hook once bustled with 20,000 dock workers. It has gentrified beyond recognition, but still maintains poverty rates 50% higher than New York City's average. Working-class families who depended on port employment never recovered economically. San Francisco's waterfront transformed into tourist destinations and luxury developments. Priced far beyond what former dock workers could ever afford, the middle-class port economy was replaced by an upper-class service economy. That new economy had no place for blue-collar workers who once made their living there. The economic savings from containerization flowed primarily to shipping companies, retailers, and consumers. The costs fell almost entirely on dock workers, their families, and port-dependent communities. That fundamental asymmetry between who benefits and who pays has defined globalization politics ever since. When politicians talk about manufacturing jobs moving to China, they're describing containerization's second-order effects. Cheap container shipping made offshore manufacturing economically viable. Transportation costs dropped to nearly negligible levels. This directly led to factory closures throughout the American Midwest and South. The container that destroyed dock worker jobs enabled the subsequent loss of millions more manufacturing jobs. Total cumulative job losses from containerization, plus globalization, likely exceeds 5 million American jobs. When you account for manufacturing, warehousing, transportation, and supply chain positions, those original 60,000 longshoremen were merely the first wave. They represented the beginning of a much larger employment restructuring that fundamentally reshaped America. Today, a single massive container ship like the Ever Given carries more cargo than 10,000 workers could manually load. That ship has a crew of 25 people and moves $10 billion in goods per voyage. The Ever Given Suez Canal blockage for 6 days in 2021 halted approximately 12% of global trade. It cost an estimated $60 billion in delayed shipments. One ship, 6 days. The entire global economy felt the impact. Containerization created such concentrated, efficient trade flows that any disruption cascades system-wide. In 2024, the average American longshoreman earns between $125,000 and $180,000 annually, with excellent benefits. This makes them among the highest-paid blue-collar workers in the country. But there are only about 25,000 of them nationwide, down from 75,000 in the mid-1950s. And automation continues reducing that number. Those remaining jobs are increasingly technical rather than physical. Modern dock workers operate computerized cranes from air-conditioned booths. They manage logistics software and oversee automated systems. It's safer, less physically demanding, and requires completely different skills. The profession lost not just jobs, but its entire cultural identity. Meanwhile, the shipping industry has never been more profitable. The top 10 container shipping companies generated combined revenues exceeding $500 billion in 2022. Profit margins reached historical highs during the pandemic-driven supply chain crisis. Those profits derive directly from containerization's efficiency revolution. Maersk, the world's largest container shipping company, operates over 700 vessels. Total capacity exceeds 4.3 million TEU. The company employs approximately 100,000 people globally. Moving equivalent cargo in the pre-container era would have required over 1 million workers. That's the fundamental math that makes this story so important. One of the 20th century's greatest economic innovations produced extraordinary aggregate benefits, while destroying the livelihoods of tens of thousands of workers who had no ability to prevent the change. Between 1956 and 1980, America lost 60,000 dock worker jobs and saved $500 billion annually in shipping costs. We chose the savings, and somewhere in a former port city, a retired longshoreman who gave 40 years to cargo handling is still wondering why his sacrifice for aggregate economic progress didn't come with genuine economic security or adequate compensation. The containerization story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about how capitalism handles technological change. When innovation creates winners and losers, should society intervene to redistribute gains from the winners to the losers? Free market advocates argue that such intervention distorts market efficiency and slows innovation. They point out that containerization's aggregate benefits far exceed the losses to displaced workers. But that calculation feels different when you're the worker losing everything versus the consumer saving $5 on imported goods. The $500 billion in annual aggregate savings divided across billions of people equals relatively small individual gains. The $200,000 annual income lost by each displaced dock worker represents economic catastrophe for specific families. Aggregate welfare improved dramatically, but individual welfare for affected workers collapsed completely. This pattern repeats throughout economic history whenever major technological shifts occur. The Luddites destroyed textile machinery in the early 1800s because automation threatened their livelihoods. History remembers them as irrational opponents of progress, but from their perspective they were defending their family's economic survival against machines that would eliminate their careers. Were they wrong to resist, or were they rational actors responding to genuine economic threats? The same questions apply to modern debates about artificial intelligence, autonomous vehicles, and automation across industries. Taxi drivers opposing Uber, retail workers concerned about Amazon, truck drivers worried about autonomous vehicles. Are they resisting inevitable progress or defending legitimate economic interests? The containerization experience suggests both perspectives contain truth. The technological change was inevitable and beneficial in aggregate, but the costs fell heavily on specific people who received inadequate support. Both statements can be true simultaneously. Port automation continues accelerating despite union resistance and political concerns. The Port of Virginia recently opened a fully automated container terminal that operates with 40% fewer workers than comparable manual facilities. It processes containers 25% faster with near-zero injury rates. The economics are so compelling that ports worldwide are following the same trajectory. The Pacific Maritime Association, which represents West Coast port employers, projects that automation will reduce dock worker employment by another 50% over the next 20 years. That means the remaining 25,000 American longshoremen could drop to just 12,500 by 2045. These aren't speculative projections. They're based on announced automation investments and deployment timelines. The ILA and ILWU can negotiate for job protections and compensation packages, but they cannot stop the underlying technological trend. The same economic logic that eliminated 60,000 jobs between 1956 and 1980 continues driving automation today. What's different now is that automation threatens white-collar professions as well as blue-collar jobs. Artificial intelligence can analyze legal documents, diagnose medical conditions, write computer code, and perform accounting tasks. The technological unemployment that longshoremen experienced in the 1960s may soon affect lawyers, doctors, programmers, and accountants. Will society handle white-collar displacement differently than blue-collar displacement? Or will highly educated professionals experience the same inadequate support that dock workers received? The containerization story suggests we haven't learned much about managing technological transitions fairly. American policy still relies primarily on market forces to reallocate displaced workers. Unemployment insurance provides temporary support, but retraining programs remain underfunded and often ineffective. The political debate about how to handle technological unemployment continues without resolution. Proposals range from universal basic income to wage insurance, to expanded retraining programs, to tax incentives for companies that maintain employment. But none of these proposals have been implemented at scale. The policy tools that might have helped displaced longshoremen don't exist 50 years later. Meanwhile, the benefits of containerization continue accumulating. Your morning coffee from Colombia costs $8 at Starbucks, partly because container shipping reduced the transportation component to under 5 cents per cup. The electronics, clothing, furniture, and countless other products in your home are affordable because containerization made global supply chains economically viable. Everyone benefits from these lower costs every single day. But those benefits came at the direct expense of dock workers who lost their careers and communities that lost their economic foundations. The trade-off is real, the benefits are real, and the costs are real. How society should handle that trade-off remains one of the fundamental unresolved questions in political economy. The longshoremen who stood on Brooklyn's piers in 1956 watching the first containers get loaded understood immediately that their world was ending. They fought desperately to preserve their livelihoods through union negotiations, strikes, and political pressure. They lost because the economic forces they opposed were simply too powerful to resist. Today, millions of workers in other industries face similar technological threats. Will they fight the same losing battles that longshoremen fought? Or will society develop better mechanisms for managing technological transitions fairly? The answer to that question will determine whether the 21st century's technological revolutions create shared prosperity or concentrated gains alongside widespread displacement. The container revolutionized global trade and eliminated 60,000 American dock worker jobs. Both outcomes were inevitable once the technology proved viable. What wasn't inevitable was the decision to provide minimal support for displaced workers. That was a policy choice that America made repeatedly and consistently. We chose to prioritize aggregate economic efficiency over individual worker security. We chose to let market forces handle technological displacement. We chose to accept concentrated costs as the necessary price of aggregate benefits. And we continue making those same choices today as new technologies threaten new categories of employment. The story of containerization and the longshoremen isn't just history. It's a preview of fights that will define the next several decades as automation and artificial intelligence transform work across the economy. The question isn't whether technology will eliminate jobs. It will. The question is whether society will do better by displaced workers than it did by the longshoremen who lost everything between 1956 and 1980. So far, the evidence isn't encouraging. We've learned to build more efficient container terminals and smarter automated systems. Though we haven't learned to support displaced workers more effectively or distribute technological benefits more equitably. The longshoremen's sacrifice enabled cheaper imports for everyone. But their families paid the full price while society captured the full benefits. That fundamental imbalance defines capitalism's approach to technological change. And until we address it directly through policy, the pattern will repeat with every new innovation that eliminates jobs while creating aggregate economic value. Between 1956 and 1980, one innovation destroyed 60,000 careers and saved the global economy $500 billion annually. We got the savings, and the dock workers got early retirement packages that didn't replace half their lost earnings. That's not just history, that's precedent for how we'll handle the next wave of technological unemployment. Then the wave after that, and the wave after that,